Well, hello, everybody. I hope you're doing great. My name is Cayetano Garcia. I am a visual artist and art director, and I'm very happy to present to you MASCULindo, a photographic essay about gender and space. So let's dive in with the presentation. And let's dive in with a picture of myself as a little kid. Since I was this age, I didn't quite fit in the society's ideal definition of what masculinity was or wasn't. Throughout my upbringing, and as I grew up in an all-boys Catholic school, I found certain spaces such as parking lots, sports fields, and piers exhausting as they triggered questions towards my own masculine identity. These spaces seemed to me more masculine than my own self-expression. I felt unsafe, looked at, and uncomfortable. So when I started doing my research, I came across to the concept of gendered spaces, places infused with any gender symbolism or a set of characteristics, and it clicked to my mind. So now let's get a little bit theoretical with this concept. Before anybody can analyze gender throughout any media, such as photography in my case, or film, or research papers, we have to bear in mind that spaces act as objects and processes in order for us to consolidate our own identity. Every space represents their own set of characteristics and rules for the expected identities that inhabit, transit, or will host. So, and we also have to keep in mind that masculine spaces all around the world represent a more rigid set of values and rules. Especially where I live in Peru, in Latin America, the macho identity takes up the majority of exterior spaces in Latin America, leaving only the interior and domestic ones the only safe spaces for feminine and queer identities such as mine. So let's, for example, if we have an individual that does not fulfill the expectations, for example, he, she, or they act, walk, or interact in a certain manner that escapes from the imposed behavior, it can lead to subordination, marginalization, and violence towards them. The vast majority of aggressions towards non-hegemonic identities tend to happen in the biggest masculine gendered space, the streets. So now let's go back again to my story. And as I grew up into a more fluid identity and making my own set of rules of how I wanted to express my masculinity or femininity, my presence turned into a defiance to these gendered spaces, as if non-masculine, hegemonic masculine presences disrupt this rigidness that they represent. That's why I knew that I needed to define my relationship between my own gender and the spaces I inhabited, because I wanted to reconcile with these old and scary locations. So, and that's how MASCULindo came about. MASCULindo is my own artistic take at how queer identities, such as mine, interact with gendered spaces. My idea with MASCULindo was simple: to capture the breaking point of these masculine places in the presence of non-hegemonic masculine identities. I wanted to visually represent how concepts such as toughness, dirtiness, and violence interacted with concepts such as pureness, vulnerability, and fluidity when queer identities were present in these masculine spaces. I wanted to portray this disharmony that these queer identities lead to these spaces. And a lot of questions came into my mind before I did this essay, and one of them was, why take pictures instead of writing a research paper? And it may sound cliche to a lot of you, and a lot of you know this saying, but an image is worth 1,000 words. But in this case, an image is worth 1,000 stories of our relationship with gender. Photography for me was the perfect medium for this project. It acts as a tool to capture exact moments in our life. So it was perfect for me to take exact glimpses at the interaction between body and space. And additionally, these are some pictures of the project. There is a lack of representation in photography, in visual arts, of the diversity of masculine identities, especially here in Latin America. In Peru, there seems to be an exact and fixated way to portray masculinity. And it's a toxic reference because it lacks of seriousness, and it's always comic and gruesome. I think that as an artist, in order for me to deconstruct the idea of hegemonic masculinity, it's important to show diversity in the photography, in the art pieces that we present to the world. So now let's get to the project. For this photo essay, I analyzed spaces that I wanted as my scenarios for this intervention. I studied the symbols, the elements, the geometry, the signs, the colors, and the objects that were present in these spaces. And I made a quick survey about how it was perceived in a larger audience. And the results were clear. The spaces had elements, or semiotically speaking, had themes that were related to this idea of hegemonic masculinity. Concepts such as rigidness, no vulnerability, dirtiness, geometry, and exteriority also are related to the idea of masculinity and also to these spaces. So that's why I chose lonely beaches, parking lots, and sports fields as my scenarios. But one of them really captured my attention, and it was the soccer fields. Since I was a little kid, and up to now, I think that soccer fields and sports fields are the most masculine places in the world. And studies show that sports fields are the places that spark the processes of gender and dominance. These places celebrate the masculine identities, excluding feminine and queer identities in this place. And how? Semiotically speaking, these spaces, the geometry and the symbols inside these fields make the hierarchization of the identities possible. Having arches, having the fact that there is spectatorship in these places, and even the color scheme make this hierarchization possible and exclusion of the feminine and non-hegemonic identities. So now it was time for me to juxtapose the non-hegemonic identities, but in other words, in an easier way, it was time for the invasion, as my advisor professor said. Before I show you the pictures, I want you to know that each character that I portray in these images represents the fluidity of my own masculine experience. Each and every one of my models has had a similar relationship with gender and space, such as mine. So here are the pictures. When I captured this photography, I had to pay close attention to the objects and elements that were present in these spaces and made them a peculiar space. For example, in this set of photographies, I want the arches, these beautiful arches, served as frames to capture that claustrophobic feeling of queer identities inside these soccer fields. I wanted them to interact with this frame and represent this feeling of being out of place. Also, the straight lines of the fields were a really beautiful contrast of the organic and fluid bodies that were present as characters, as the queer identities. I also used vertical compositions and square compositions to contrast the horizontality of the place. And also for the acting of the models, I chose a more nostalgic acting to transport us back to our early years. Finally, my picture, I chose this location, these rocks that led to the ocean, to capture the feeling of being out of place and being lost. I also work with trios for pictures, to work for sequences. And yeah, that's some of the pictures of this project. Also, it was important for me to capture the interaction between these characters. And before I worked in MASCULindo, all my work, I used to hint certain themes of homoeroticness. I like to keep my photos sensual, and MASCULindo wasn't an exception for this. And as I did my research of these spaces, I came across to the fact that these spaces were places that made the exchange of fluids possible. Just imagine the soccer players, after they had a match in the soccer fields, they're gonna exchange sweat. Or when you go for a swim and you come out, you're gonna exchange some droplets of the ocean. This idea stuck in my mind, and it sounds very homoerotic to me. And I knew that it had to be present in the pictures and in their interaction with the characters. And also I put them in pure white underwear because I want them to feel like they were gonna get dirty. They were gonna get this pureness in contrast of the dirtiness, and in the color scheme of browns, they were gonna feel more out of place, and they will find each other as partners. To conclude my presentation, one of my biggest objectives with MASCULindo was to encourage a larger audience to understand our relationship between gender and the spaces we inhabit every single day. I wanted to have an answer to why we felt so out of place in these spaces and the power that we had as we disrupt this rigidness that surrounds us. My peers constantly ask me why I choose identity, gender, and vulnerability as my themes in my photographies. And I believe that it is the most sincere way that I can reconcile through photography to these places and these experiences. Revisiting these places was not an easy task. It was really triggering because they represent a scary location through my vulnerable time in my life. But throughout this project, I realized that, and made me understand that the self-existence and presence of non-hegemonic identities is enough to question the old ideas of masculinity and the hegemonic masculinity. Thank you very much.